Welcome everybody to the second session in our course development workshop series. If you did not get a chance to attend the first one, I want to put into the chat the link to the, there's chat, the link to the video before. And I just realized, oh, so this is exactly what I said I wasn't going to do. This is the link to the actual video, but we do have a playlist, and before the end of this session, I will have a link to the playlist so that whether or not you can attend every session, you'll have the recordings in the future. So let's get this party started. So first off, I want to make sure that you all know the purpose and the agenda of our meeting. We have, it is multi-purpose, but I wanted to let you know that the Course Development Workshop Series intends to lay the foundation for the best practices in course development through instruction on and discussion of the fundamentals of course development. And regardless of your academic role, or the institution that you work full-time for or part-time for, understanding our course development fundamentals is valuable to many positions without not only in our institution, but at any institution. So becoming competent in this area is a valuable skill that you can use throughout your career. How we're going to start off today is we're going to talk about how to write a good CLO. We're going to bring in a faculty perspective. We're going to talk about using CLOs in course facilitation because course development is not a one-time event. It affects everything that happens in the class, even after it goes live, and then putting into practice. So we're going to pull some of the information that we talked about in our first session. It's okay if you didn't attend the first session or haven't seen it. We'll review what those components are. And then we hope that you are engaged throughout. Please feel free to put questions in the chat. Because this is a webinar, you have been muted, but feel free to use the reactions, to clap, to heart, to raise your hand, to put information in the chat. We want you to be participatory in this workshop. So I am going to hand this off to Nikki Perry to get us started talking about how to write a good CLO.
Hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. So as we mentioned in our last session, and apologies if you can hear a helicopter over my apartment, but as we talked about in our last session, really having measurable CLOs is the foundation and the driver of any course development. And I like to think of a CLO as having two parts, the Bloom's verb and the actual skills and content of the CLO. So to help you determine how you want to write your CLO, I like to ask myself two questions. So the what do I want the students to learn? And that's really going to be that content and that meat of your CLO. And then the how do you want the students to demonstrate what they've learned? And that's going to be the Bloom's verb that you choose. So I find those two questions really good to help get you thinking and get you started when writing the CLO. And then if we can head to the next slide. So just a little bit more information on the what. So the what is going to be those skills, abilities, knowledge that you want the students to learn once they've successfully completed your course. And some ways to do that is consulting with peers, looking at industry standards, looking at changes within an industry, and really making sure that that content is clear, concise, and achievable within a course time frame. So I know we have some business folks and people who teach ASH 101 and Business 105 on this course or on this webinar. So I kind of like to think of it as like a SMART goal almost. So you want it to be specific, you want it to be achievable, relevant, and time bound. So that's how you get the content of the CLO. And then that how, the Bloom's verb, I like to think of that as the measurable part of the CLO. So when selecting a Bloom's verb, always make sure you're referring to the Bloom's Taxonomy Guide. Now you can find this in the Course Design Cafe. You can reach out to me or anybody on my team and we'll provide you with one. And you can also do a quick Google search and you'll find a lot of great resources as well. One thing I really want to impart is with a strong CLO, it just has one Bloom's verb, just one. And you want to think about the course level and what the students, the knowledge the students are having when they come into your course. For example, if it's a 100 or 200 level course, you're not going to expect the students to be able to, for example, create a SWOT analysis, but maybe you'd want, if it's a marketing course, but maybe you'd want them to be able to describe the components of a SWOT analysis. As we move to higher level courses that require students to have a higher level of cognition, you're going to look at that Bloom's taxonomy guide and select higher level Bloom's verbs, because that's more appropriate for the student's existing knowledge and what you want them to demonstrate that they're able to do once they leave your course. So those are really the two components that I think of a great CLO, and I'll hand it over to Jen to give the faculty perspective.
Thanks, Nikki. So I'm going to kind of share some things that I do and consider when I'm using the information that Nikki just shared about figuring out the what and the how to help create our course learning outcomes. And one of the first things that I do when I'm sitting down to look and think about course learning outcomes is trying to make sure that I know what's going on and what's happening and what's relevant in the field in regards to the content in the course. And there's three ways that I'll do that. The first is that I take time to search for other courses that are related to the content area to see what's happening. What do I see as common trends and common threads from institution to institution that might have similar courses? And then what do I kind of see as those outliers? Or is there a niche within a particular content area that can make our course in a particular content area unique and stand out from similar type courses in other institutions? Another thing that I'll do, especially in that beginning phase where you're starting to kind of put your ideas together for a course and thinking about what you want your students to know, and you're usually engaged at that time in some type of search for a textbook, is to look at textbooks, and not even necessarily just the textbook that you end up selecting, but all the textbook options that you have, and see what are some of the objectives that are in those texts, right? We know that the authors of the textbooks that we're using are experts in terms of content in the field. So what are they saying? What do they think that students should know about a particular content area after they've read their entire textbook? And I'll start to look at some of those objectives and see if I can group and gather them into some common themes and patterns. And then another really important piece for me is connecting with associate faculty that teach the courses that I'm working on, looking at new outcomes for and developing, and to find out what is their feedback, what are they noticing from their students, what do they see as strengths, what do they see as struggles. And so these three things together are really kind of where I do my brainstorming to start to formulate the main big concept ideas to bring into our course learning outcomes. So I wanted to pause there for a minute and find out, what do you guys do when you're trying to determine what are those big key concept takeaways that you want to integrate into your course learning outcomes? Do you search for other institutions? Do you look through textbooks? How do you go about searching? Let's just pause for a minute and have some conversation in the chat about what the process might look like for you when you're determining those big ideas to pull into your course outcomes, when you're figuring out all those what pieces that Nikki was talking about. Yeah, Jen, going to AF first. They're so valuable. So much insight into what's happening in our courses. Ooh, that's great, Allie. And I'm going to touch upon something that I think will connect with that when we get to our next slide, but looking for those big pieces that students cannot exit the course without knowing. What are the things that they absolutely have to know? I talked in our last session about those as kind of those non-negotiable pieces of content. And these are some of those ways that will help to figure out what are those non-negotiables that we want our students to know. Yeah. Looking for the textbook if there's one already selected. And I found it's really valuable that looking through all of the textbooks that are presented as options for the course, even if it's not the textbook that I end up selecting to use in a course, a lot of times there's valuable information to help narrow down those big ideas and concepts. So they're a great place to gather thoughts from. Program learning outcomes, absolutely. We're going to touch on that in a minute, Trisha. Yep, so a little bit of foreshadowing of what's coming there. Looking at data, yep, Jen, exactly. Looking for syllabi for similar named courses. Patricia, that's exactly when I talked about that part about searching for other courses. We'll go and just do a broad internet search and see, okay, what other courses are out there? We're going to use today, we're going to continue talking about the positive learning environments course we touched upon in our first session. And so I'll just do a search. Okay, I'm looking for courses on positive learning environments in early childhood and what's going on, what's happening, what ideas are out there. Brainstorming across disciplines, that's a great one, Dana, and figuring out kind of what's happening across different fields. And we all know that a lot of times in our courses, we have students that might be in our courses who are taking them as an elective or from different programs. So we certainly want to make sure we're taking that broad, big bird's eye look. Getting information from AFs in subsequent courses, Amy. So looking at what courses are coming next afterwards and getting information so that we can provide that scaffolding and make sure that that's in place for our students. That's a really great one too. These are lots of really awesome ideas. So keep them coming in the chat because we can all keep learning from each other as we move on and continue to talk about some other things that I consider when I'm looking at developing course learning outcomes. Kate, can you move the slide? Perfect. So couple of things that were brought up in the chat are things that I do as well right here. So when we just talked about the what piece, right, that content piece, but then the other piece of the course learning outcomes that Nikki talked about is the how, which is our Bloom's verbs. And so when I'm thinking about the content, I also want to make sure that I'm bringing that content into the course learning outcomes at the appropriate level for the course. And there's really two things that I rely on to help make those decisions. One of them is looking at our curriculum map. So I have just a picture up here of one piece of a curriculum map for the specific course where it has all of our course learning outcomes listed and then mapped to the program outcomes. And the R's on here, if you're not familiar, is for that reinforced. So we'll map them to either introduced, which is they're beginning, they're just learning, reinforcing that content. And then if there was an M, it would be for mastery. And so in this particular course, we know that our course learning outcomes are at that reinforced level when they're being mapped to our program outcomes, which means that our students have had other opportunities in previous courses to learn content that's connected to helping them ultimately master those program learning outcomes, but they're not at that mastery level yet. And so this is really important when I'm thinking about the how part of the course learning outcome, because I want to make sure that when I'm writing my outcomes and I'm choosing my Bloom's verbs, that I'm choosing Bloom's verbs that aren't at too high of a level for where the students are at in their program. So if we look at this first course learning outcome here, this course learning outcome is at that analyze level, but the program learning outcome, PLO1, is up at the synthesize level, up at that higher level. So when I am constructing my course learning outcomes, I want to think about this is a concept that's mapped to a program learning outcome that's reinforced. So I don't want to go with a basic level of Bloom's verb because they've already been introduced, but I'm not ready to take them all the way to mastery. So I want to consider that when I'm thinking about what Bloom's verbs do I want to use. And if you don't know how to find your curriculum map, Kate just put a link in the chat to where you can locate those. And I know that Nikki and her team is happy to help walk through those as well. The other thing, and this came up in the chat too when we're looking for ideas, is that course snapshot data. And this is really important when thinking about looking at course learning outcomes, especially for a course that's been an existing course, because we have data on how our students are performing on each of our course learning outcomes. So when we look at that data, if we see that we have a course learning outcome where students have been struggling and not meeting the expected level of mastery, then we definitely want to dig into that and consider whether or not it has to do with how that outcome's written. Are we asking too little of our students and our Bloom's level is too low? Are we asking too much and our Bloom's level is too high, depending on where students are in that course within their program? So those are two things that are really valuable tools for me when I'm looking at the level of Bloom's verbs when drafting CLOs. Go ahead, Kate, if you want to move to the next one. There it is. So once I've kind of analyzed and thought about what level of Bloom's verbs we want to be at, then I think of this as kind of like I'm going shopping, right? To find the right fit of the right Bloom's verb at that level. And I have to try on multiple verbs. So I will write out the same course learning outcome with the content and try it out with different verbs. And we're going to show you some examples of that later, but you have to write it out and think about it from different angles and which verb makes sense. And one thing that I really ask myself when I look at the statement with each of those different Bloom's verbs is, okay, what are the students going to do that demonstrates mastery based on how that CLO is written? If I use a certain verb, what is it that I'm asking for students to be able to do and show as what they could do? How are they going to demonstrate mastery of that? So try on different Bloom's verbs at the beginning of your CLOs and find the one that fits right. Find the one that allows your students to demonstrate their mastery of that content in a way that makes sense for the level of the course and also the content of the course. And I'm going to pause right there for a minute because I see a lot of things happening in the chat. Does anybody else do a similar type approach too? Do you try on different Bloom's verbs, or how do you help, go about figuring out which Bloom's verb you want to use in your course learning outcome? Yeah, Allie, talking it through, and we're going to show some of that when we get to some examples later on of some back and forth conversation of working through figuring out the right Bloom's verbs for some outcomes. Yeah, Tanya, the level of learning and the type of activity that they're going to be doing. I think that level of learning is so crucial, right? Making sure that it aligns with where we've mapped that particular course in regards to overall mastery of the program outcomes. Scaffolding blooms up to match the course sequence numbers. So Patricia, I'm assuming by that you mean using lower level blooms in lower level courses, and then those highest level blooms when you get to your capstones in those 400 level courses, or I'm not sure if you're in masters, but I'm assuming that's what you mean. Yeah, Jen, once you understand the assessment, you can work on verbs that match it. Yeah, that matching piece is key to make sure we're not too low, but that we're not too high, and that we're meeting our students, just at that right level for what the needs are of that course. All right, Kate, let's go ahead and move on. Perfect. So once I kind of have what I've tried on all those Bloom's verbs and have what feels like the right fit, just to double check, I always make sure that I brainstorm a list of possible weekly learning outcomes to make sure that that course learning outcome is big enough and a broad enough umbrella, right? That CLO, we want it to encompass all of the things that students need to be able to do to master it. So if I start brainstorming and I can only think of 1 or 2 skills or things that would fall underneath that, then I might need to consider if I need to broaden my course learning outcome. We want our course learning outcomes not to be things that we're asking students to do in assignments, but rather those big takeaways of mastery of knowledge. What is it that they should be, have when they leave that course? So this is something that's really helpful. If I can't come up with enough things that would fall underneath it, then I need to think about how to broaden that course learning outcome. All right, and next slide. And then this last piece is something that's newer to what I've started to consider when looking at course learning outcomes as we as an institution have implemented the DEI rubric, starting to really think about the components of the DEI rubric that come into play with course outcomes. And I just grabbed a little snippet on here of the actual criteria from the rubric for course learning outcomes, but it's something that is now in the forefront of my mind when drafting that language in course learning outcomes is, have I woven in language that helps to make the course learning outcomes more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive, because including that language in my course outcomes is ultimately going to drive including that within the course as a whole. And you'll see how we did that in a course when we get towards a little bit more towards the end. And I'm going to go ahead now and hand things over to Amy.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. So we've been over the importance of course learning outcomes and strategies for doing so, but we want to also acknowledge that these learning outcomes don't exist in a vacuum. Okay, in fact, just as CLOs drive course development, we want to emphasize that CLOs should similarly drive course instruction. Go ahead, Kate, if you want to move to the next slide. So faculty, you play a critical role in relation to students achieving these course learning outcomes. So with that in mind, if you could move ahead, please, Kate. We want to make sure that faculty are proactively examining CLOs prior to teaching. And we do that by asking faculty to review the CLOs in the course guide prior to prep week or during prep week. Because being aware of the CLOs and even the WLOs will help faculty to organize feedback and guide engagement in the course. And if you can go ahead and move forward, Kate. It's also obviously very important that you make sure to communicate these learning outcomes to the students. I'm sure you've all heard the expression, you can't hit a target you can't see. So making them aware of how they can, or the skills and abilities they're going to walk away from the class with is really valuable. And you can do this by sharing via announcements, maybe an announcement prior to the start of the course in which you outline the skills and things students are going to work on in that class, or even at the end of the course. You could summarize what students should be able to walk away with, or the skills that they should feel that they confidently possess. It's also a good idea to put in an announcement prior to certain discussions or assignments or quizzes, the expectations related to the course learning outcomes. And discussion forums, they're another great space where you can, it's another venue for communicating CLOs. For example, in a discussion forum, you could say, okay, one learning outcome for this class is the ability to develop a social media marketing campaign. In this week's discussion, we're going to work on defining our purpose. This is the first important step of any social media marketing campaign, and that sort of thing. So let's take a moment, if you can, and type in the chat maybe some other ideas you have about how you can enhance your course facilitation by bringing in those CLOs with students. And obviously you can clearly do the same thing with assignment and quiz feedback. But I'll give you guys a minute to type in if you have some other ideas for incorporating those into your instruction. Oops. Okay, sorry, I need to scroll down and find the latest. Wonderful. Allison says she includes them in her weekly tips announcement. Trisha says asking students if they feel they've mastered a particular CLO or WLO as a result of completing an activity. That's a great idea, Trisha. I knew instructors who used to say, you know, you need to learn these things. If you don't feel like you've learned these things by the end of the course, you come back and see me, because they felt it was their responsibility to make sure students didn't walk away feeling like they'd missed out. Ask about the muddiest point aligned with the CLOs. Another really good idea. Some things are going to need clarification. That's also fantastic information for course developers if you can share that as you move forward. We have a course with a survey that asks students if they feel they met each CLO each week. That's wonderful. Wonderful. Love the muddiest point. Yes, I do too. Kate always tries to tie in her weekly intro announcements so students understand why we're completing the learning activity we're doing during the week. And that is so important too, the why behind it, instead of just feeling like it's some meaningless exercise in cyberspace. Understanding the purpose behind the discussions, the quizzes, the assignments. Wonderful. I include the WLO in my weekly announcement and ask students to comment on how they meet CLOs in the final discussion and what they may need to do to complete them. Wonderful, Gwen. All fantastic ideas here. These are great. Thank you so much for sharing these, and I'll move on and let Trisha go ahead and share her content.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be joining you. I'm going to tag team with Jen and Nikki because I've had some computer issues today. But in the last course development session, we looked at some sample course learning outcomes and talked a little bit about ones that were problematic and some possible fixes that might be made to these. So I know Jen and her colleagues spent some time reviewing these CLOs and had a really good dialogue based on some of her strategies that she just talked about how they might rethink the expected course learning for the students. Jen, do you want to share a little bit about those conversations that you had?
Yeah. Oh, I think I'm off mute now. Yeah, we are going to dig into those. But before we do that, we thought that Nikki and I thought we would maybe do a quick review on this slide of which course learning outcomes, just to kind of refresh, thinking about everything we talked about today, right? About making sure that they're measurable, only one Bloom's verb, not just statements of things that students can do. Are they measurable? That we thought we would do a little refresh on this one. So Nikki, did you want to guide us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So here is as Jen mentioned, an example of a course and course description and course learning outcomes. And we have some good learning outcomes and we have some learning outcomes here to trick you. So I'll walk you through, but if anybody wants to guess what learning outcomes should be revised in the chat, I look forward to reading those. But again, making sure you have an appropriate and measurable Bloom's verb, making sure it's just one Bloom's verb. So for example, yes, Patricia, is what I was just about to say. So number 2, appreciate the value of a high quality learning environment. How do you really measure how somebody's going to appreciate something? It needs to be more specific. So if this learning outcome were to come onto my desk, I would recommend that the faculty look at the Bloom's taxonomy and revise with a more measurable Bloom's verb. Also, CLO 4, learn about diverse childhood populations. Oh yeah, Michelle just mentioned it as well. Again, learn isn't really a measurable Bloom's verb. So what is something, do you want them to analyze diverse childhood populations, describe? Again, we just need to make sure that it's more measurable.
Sorry, Nikki, I'm going to step in with number 4. Learn is what the students are actually going to do in the course versus what the students can do as a result of completing the course. So that's another consideration. That also kind of ties in with number 10, which is to complete the final project for the course. That's something that they're actually doing during the course. Number 10 could probably be tweaked into a weekly learning outcome if needed, but definitely isn't broad enough, thinking back to what Jen shared with us, to really be a course learning outcome. Thanks.
Absolutely. That's a great point. Again, the learning outcomes, they should be what the students can do at the end of the course once they've successfully completed it. So yeah, I'm looking in the chat. I know someone mentioned understand. Again, that's not a measurable verb. Number 9, identify and explain. Those are 2 verbs. And when you do want to use 2 verbs, for example, you're going to choose the higher Bloom's verb because the assumption is that if students are able to, in this case, explain how to implement appropriate strategies for classroom management, they must know how to identify those strategies before they can explain them. So yes, Elena, you mentioned number 10, and Kate, yes, that is kind of the hidden one. So why are there 10 CLOs?
Number 6 is also a funny one. There's nothing wrong with how it's written per se, but I don't know if anyone remembers back to our previous session. Why is number 6 problematic?
That's a tricky one. You might want to read the course description and kind of see why that one doesn't belong.
While you're comparing 6 to the description of the course, that what we're inviting students to learn about and be able to do at the completion of a course should be in sync. And often we see a discrepancy between the course description and the course learning outcomes. So that's a tricky one, but want to make note of the fact that the learning outcomes should align with the course description.
So yeah, I think that the chat has kind of died down a bit, but yeah, number 6, it actually doesn't relate to the course. Nothing about the course talks about public policy and the role of legislation. So that's why that one wouldn't be of mention. But Jen, do you want to go ahead and talk about how you revised your CLOs?
Yep. So we're going to get to that. What we want to do real quick first, Kate, if you move the slide, is to take a minute and give you guys the opportunity based on the conversation that we just had, thinking about making sure our verbs are measurable, that we don't have more than one, etc. We thought it would be a good chance to give you the opportunity to look at what were the current outcomes that were in this particular course and to throw out some suggestions and ideas on if you see anything within what are actually the 4 outcomes that were in this course. We had 10 on the last slide because we threw some extra things in there for some teaching opportunities, but these were the 4 outcomes that were actually in the course. And so we wanted to see, based on everything we've kind of talked about today, if you have any thoughts or suggestions on if this was your course, right? And yes, we're not doing that deep search into content, but if you were just looking at the measurability factor, the Bloom's level, do they read correctly? Are they too narrow, etc.? What are some ways that you might consider modifying or adjusting these particular outcomes? And Kate's going to capture them from the chat and put them up on here in this empty blue box so we can kind of see. And then we're going to show you what actually happened as we went through some conversation with these outcomes. What other ideas do we have? Change, recommend to propose. Definitely a stronger verb, Jen. Think about when Trisha just shared about when we're looking at outcomes, and we don't want outcomes to be things that our students are going to do while they're in that course, but things that they're going to be able to do once they've mastered that knowledge and content when they've walked away. Can we break number 3 into 2? Explain becomes identify. Not sure on IRM. Yeah, Allie, it's a little bit tricky without knowing exactly where the sequence fits within the program. We just thought it'd be a good opportunity to do a little bit of practice of thinking about some of those ideas. But yeah, it might be, that's that idea of trying on different verbs, right? Do we want to use explain? Do we want to use identify? Which one fits better? What subskills could fall underneath that if we switched from explain to identify? Any other thoughts? Any other ideas? Okay, so let's go ahead and move forward, and we'll show you some of the conversation that happened as I dove into this conversation with my colleague and partner, Michelle Simasek. So we gathered and captured some of the chat conversation that we had back and forth because we wanted to really highlight then when we're working on these course learning outcomes that it's a collaborative process, that we don't want to necessarily do it in a silo. We know that a lot of times we develop courses on our own and sometimes we develop them with a partner, but even if we're developing them on our own, the value of connecting with others who are knowledgeable in that field, whether it's other full-time faculty, pulling in your associate faculty, et cetera, so that you have back and forth ideas and conversations to consider. So in the chat, Jen, you talked about how do we create high quality learning environments, might want to revise. And then Elena chimed in with change from create to a verb that would be easier to measure in the classroom. So here was some of our conversation as we started to play. We had just completed our DEI audit. And so when we went through our DEI audit in this particular course, Michelle and I received feedback that we had a lot of really great content. This course is about creating learning environments for early childhood, and that we could more intentionally focus on how to make sure those environments were more diverse and more equitable and more inclusive of students. So that was at the forefront when Michelle and I first started working on these particular outcomes. And so you can see we started trying to pull that language into all of our outcomes. And so then we were having some back and forth of, do we need to pull it in everywhere? Is there a place for it to be just in one, or do we need it in multiple? And then wondering, you can see some of the conversation here about, do we want to change some of our language? Is there a better word than instruction? Maybe instruction lends itself to teaching lessons versus creating environments. Do we want to talk more about explaining strategies? And then, do we need a higher verb than explain? Let's think about where this course falls in our sequence. How does it align with our mapping? Do we want to keep putting DEI here? So you can kind of, read through everything that's on there. And then this last one, we had some back and forth conversation of, do we think that this last learning outcome was already encompassed in the ideas that we had in our first 3 CLOs? And if so, was there a different big idea that we should bring in there so that we could broaden the scope of what was happening in the course? If you go to the next slide, Kate. you can see then we kept continuing on with our conversation and going back and forth with each other. We just did this all through those comments with our Word document. But we're looking at, okay, do we want to try the word examine? Would we want to try the word design? And then going back and forth with, we might try examine, but could we consider evaluate? Do we think it's easier to assess evaluating something than students examining something? And so just trying to show for you guys some of that back and forth conversation that can happen, and really playing through that trying it on piece of the Bloom's verbs to try and find ones that have the best fit, that are broad enough, that really let us to assess what it is that we're looking to assess with our students, and to make sure that we are not at too low of a level, but that we're also not going too high based on where the course is. And then we ended up talking some more about maybe pulling DEI and saying, I don't know that I love that verb recommend, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to put instead. And so kind of having that back and forth conversation. And then if you go one more slide, Kate, you can see where we kind of ended up when we started to clean them up. And then Nikki, we sent, after we had them pretty clean, we sent them to our assessment specialist, which was Anne Marie. We sent them, and then she provided some feedback. And Nikki, did you want to talk through this one? Because I know this is one that we keep trying to reinforce when we're working on our outcomes.
Yes, absolutely. And I do want to stress that I know we've given you all so much information, and I want you to know that assessment, we always have your back. We're always here for any questions, any issues, any brainstorming. So every time you revise your CLOs and you fill out that course change form or the new course form, assessment is always looking at it, and we're always reviewing those CLOs just to make sure that they are appropriate and they're measurable, and really picked out a great thing that, as Jen mentioned, we really want to impart on everyone, which is we want to make sure that the CLOs are what the students are going to do once they've successfully completed the course. So sometimes that means just readjusting the language a little bit. So in this case, instead of design a high quality learning environment that meets the needs of diverse learners, she recommended just changing it to create a high quality learning environment, because it's what the students are going to do once they've completed the course. But yeah, I just always want to impart that if you have any questions about the CLOs, please reach out to your dedicated assessment specialist. We are always here to help you.
Thanks. And then if you go to the last slide, Kate, it just shows, we just put on here, what were the current and then what were the revised course learning outcomes, so you could kind of compare and see the two differences that were made. We ended up not making a lot of changes in terms of content, but we did make adjustments to several of our course learning, or our verbs, and we also made adjustments where we had that conversation about pulling in DEI and choosing specific places to pull that in rather than in each one. So just trying to show that collaborative process, try things on. It's messy. You're going to go back and forth until you find what is the right fit for your course.
This is Trisha, and if I might add something that I'd like to kind of give a commendation to Jen and her team about, is you'll notice that they have 4 course learning outcomes. And I think what I see often is faculty trying to shove a lot into a lot of learning outcomes. And one of the great things that Jen and her team did here was they kept these outcomes a little more broad, but still measurable. So then they can put the content, the meat of the course, into the weekly learning outcomes. What I think Nikki and the team often see are 8 to 10 learning outcomes, and faculty are like, well, there's so much that my students need to be able to do in this course or after this course. But when we really start having those conversations about what is it that you want the students to be able to walk away being able to do, tends to end up being a little more broad and a little more focused. And I think that's where less is more in terms of learning outcomes. So I want to just give a kudos to Jen and her team on keeping things straight.